They called him a walking odor, sprayed perfume in his path like he was disease, laughed when he passed, mimicked his accent, crumpled his name like trash. In a room full of handshakes and titles, he was the joke, targeted, cornered, reduced to the color of his skin and the weight of a mop. They stripped his name, rewrote his worth, and fed each other cruelty like it was company policy. No one questioned it. No one stopped it. Because in their eyes, he was just the black janitor who didn't know his place. But what they didn't know, what not one of them ever saw coming, was that everything they used to humiliate him would soon be the reason they'd beg to keep their jobs. This isn't just a story about bullying. It's about what happens when a man stays silent long enough to let truth do the talking. If you're ready for a real reckoning, hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And tell us, how would you treat someone if you thought they had nothing, only to learn they had everything? Silas Weaver arrived before sunrise each morning, rolling his cleaning cart down the gleaming marble floor of Halden and Royce Industries. The corporate lobby yawned with cold silence, reflecting 100 tiny downlights in the polished walls of glass and steel. He wore his navy coveralls neatly buttoned to the collar, black gloves folded into his back pocket, and his ID clipped low to avoid drawing attention. He never made much noise, except for the faint squeak of his cart's front wheel, a squeak they liked to mock. They didn't use his name. He was Spinny Wheels Windex Warrior, labels given with grins and nods that expected him to smile back, play along, and know his place. They threw him these names like breadcrumbs to pigeons. Once, he corrected them. Just once. That was the day he became Spinny for good, because when Silas spoke with a soft accent from growing up between Juarez and El Paso, they heard comedy, not dignity. It was a Monday when Mara from Public Relations strutted in late, wearing red stilettos that matched the slice of lipstick she kept reapplying every 10 minutes. She stopped in front of his cart, glanced around, then dropped an old lipstick tube right into the top of his cleaning tray. With perfect theater, she gasped, staggered back, and shrieked there was a rat. Voices echoed. Laughter followed. Colin from logistics leaned around the corner, saw the setup, and shouted something about rodents learning to contour. Silas said nothing. He didn't flinch. He picked up the lipstick with 2 fingers and tossed it into the trash liner. The janitor cart rolled forward. The audience dispersed. 30 minutes later, on the 5th floor, he was wiping down the conference table when someone crumpled a napkin, aimed it at the trash can, missed, and barked at him to clean it like a good boy. The man didn't look up from his laptop. No one else in the room even acknowledged the exchange. In the hallway, 2 interns passed by and elbowed each other, whispering loudly enough about the hallway smelling like a wet mop had been married to a sewer. Silas kept wiping. No expression. At lunch, in the service hallway near the boiler, he ate quietly, a cold sandwich and an orange wrapped in tinfoil. He watched pigeons pecking at crumbs near the loading dock. Inside, he was expected to stay invisible, but outside, even the birds treated him like he mattered. When he returned upstairs, someone had drawn a cartoon on the whiteboard in the staff room, a janitor with exaggerated ears and a bucket for a head, with a bubble that said, "Clean or be cleaned." It wasn't funny. It wasn't original, but it had earned laughs. Silas erased it wordlessly. At 2 p.m., the restroom near the executive suites flooded. When he arrived, 3 young employees from marketing stood outside, joking about Silas getting to swim in his element. One held his nose theatrically. Another pretended to slip and fall. They didn't stop when he entered the room. They just laughed louder. When he emerged half an hour later, soaked with gray water from the burst pipe, they applauded. One snapped his fingers and said, "Damn, the man takes his job literally." Silas walked past them without a word. At 3:15, a request came through his work phone. Clean up conference 7 after the investor briefing. When he arrived, the room was spotless, but taped to the wall above the waste bin was a sign. This area reserved for Spinny and friends. Drawn beneath it was a stick figure hunched over a mop, with oversized teeth and drooping eyes. Silas peeled it off, folded it 4 times, and placed it into his cart. At 4 o'clock, a junior analyst called him over while holding out an empty coffee cup like he was a waiter. She said she needed a refill. Her friends laughed when she dropped a few coins into his breast pocket and told him to keep the change. When he said nothing, she raised an eyebrow and asked if he even understood English. By the time the first cluster of suits entered the office, Silas was already scrubbing coffee rings off the break room counters. That's where he noticed it. At first, he thought it was just another notice board flyer, perhaps a team-building event or a motivational poster. But then he saw it clearly. There, taped above the staff kitchenette, was a digitally printed image, a grotesque edit of a public restroom stall, its walls defaced with graffiti and photoshopped onto it his own face. It was clipped from his ID badge, placed directly above a cartoon drawing of a clogged toilet. In bold, serif type across the top, it read, "Warning, biohazard. Contains permanent odor." Silas didn't react immediately. He simply stared, his chest rising slowly, his hand still holding the disinfectant bottle. Around him, muffled chuckles flared and faded like stage cues in a well-rehearsed play. Someone passed behind him and whispered, not quite low enough, "Guess Spinney finally made it to the Wall of Fame." Another voice, female, added, "Should have worn his hazmat suit." As he peeled the image down, he heard the zip of a backpack, the rustle of someone leaving in haste, as if their part of the performance was done. He didn't turn. He folded the paper neatly, as he had done with the others, and tucked it beneath his cleaning cloths. Then he kept working. But it didn't end there. That day, as Silas moved from one floor to the next, the assault on his dignity continued, not with words, but with smells. It started in the finance department. As he rolled his cart through the hallway, someone sprayed cologne in the air as he passed. Not directly at him, but near him, deliberately timed. The scent was harsh, chemical, cloying. He said nothing, kept walking. The next floor, it happened again. This time, it was air freshener, lemon-scented, sprayed twice behind his back. Laughter followed, soft but unmistakable. Then came the theatrics. On the marketing floor, 2 junior associates sat near the coffee station. One held a tissue to her nose. The other waved a notebook in front of her face. "God, what is that?" one of them groaned. The other sniffed the air dramatically and muttered, "Did something die in the janitor's closet?" As Silas knelt to clean a spill, he saw the shadow of a phone lifted discreetly, then pulled away. But there were no clicks, no flashes. They didn't care to record him. They didn't need proof. They wanted him to feel the shame, and they made sure he did. Even the elevators became a stage. That afternoon, as he stepped into the lift with 3 employees from operations, one of them immediately turned to the others and said, "Oh man, my stomach's already turning." Another pulled his shirt over his nose, eyes exaggeratedly wide. "Don't breathe through your mouth, it's worse." They laughed all the way to the 10th floor. Silas stood still. The floor numbers blinked above him, red and silent. The final straw came just after dusk in the basement hallway near the freight elevators. There on the side of a janitorial storage locker, someone had written in thick red marker, "Caution, sewer creature inside." The words dripped like mock blood. Below, it was another crude drawing, his silhouette, hunched, with green fumes curling off his shoulders. Silas didn't touch it. Not this time. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the cart, the other pressed to his thigh. Then he turned and walked away. No one followed. No one stopped him. The building swallowed the moment as if it never happened. He ended his shift in silence, the fluorescent lights of the service hall casting long shadows behind him. In the staff lounge, the image of his face had already been replaced with a new flyer, this one promoting a team happy hour. No trace remained of the graffiti or the drawing. They knew how to hide the evidence. They always had. But Silas remembered everything. He remembered the way the hallway smelled of perfume and ammonia. He remembered the look on the intern's face as she giggled behind her coffee cup. He remembered the weight of that word creature scrawled on metal, how it echoed louder than a shout. What was unusual, however, was the silence when he walked through the open banquet doors. The room was mostly empty now, save for a few stragglers in suits and half-removed heels. The music had died, but the scent of champagne and sweat lingered in the air like perfume overwrought. As Silas rolled his cart toward the supply closet near the side exit, he noticed something wrong. The mop bucket wasn't where he had left it. Neither was the spare shirt he always kept tucked behind the linens, his backup uniform for spills and sweat. A strange knot formed in his gut. The silence around him wasn't real silence. It was the kind that hovered right before a punchline. He turned the corner near the service entrance and froze. There in the janitorial sink basin, submerged and soaking in dark, cloudy water, was his shirt. His official company shirt, embroidered with his name, crooked, worn, but still his. Next to it, stuffed halfway into the adjacent toilet, was the backup shirt, sodden, streaked with something brown, and twisted like it had been wrung out and shoved there by force. On the mirror above the sink, scrawled in lipstick and black marker, were the words, "Clean this, Spinny." His reflection warped behind the lettering, a blurry shape of fatigue and humiliation. From behind, muffled laughter erupted. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. He turned slowly, his breath lodged deep in his chest, and saw them. 3 men, ties loose, cheeks flushed from drink, leaning against the doorframe of the service corridor with grins that dripped cruelty. One of them nudged the other with an elbow and muttered, "Janitor Olympics, just got an upgrade." Silas said nothing. He stepped forward, reached into the sink, and pulled the shirt from the water. It was cold, heavy, dripping. He didn't look at them. He didn't ask why. He already knew. He carried the wet fabric back to his cart, wrapped it in plastic, and began his cleanup routine like the night wasn't crumbling quietly around him. But the worst hadn't arrived yet. The true desecration didn't happen in a back hallway or janitor's closet. It happened in plain sight. The next day, during the post-gala debrief meeting, Silas was asked to clean the presentation stage before the executives arrived. As he stepped onto the platform with his bucket and cloth, the conference room already half filled with upper management. Someone in the front row coughed loudly and leaned toward the person beside them. The whisper was deliberate, but the volume was performative. "Hope he doesn't drip sewage all over the PowerPoint." Another voice chimed in from the back. Maybe they should have invited him to the party. Then again, that bathroom incident might have been the party. Laughter echoed like gunshots in a cave. Silas focused on the smudge of fingerprint grease on the touchscreen. Wiped, polished, moved on. The room grew quieter when the department heads filed in. The jokes didn't. That afternoon, in the elevator, the tension escalated from laughter to performance. A young associate named Bryce stepped in just as the doors were closing, glanced at Silas, and theatrically flinched. "Whoa," he said, raising both hands like shielding himself from a spill. "Should I be worried? I read somewhere that mold can spread from janitor uniforms." 2 others in the lift chuckled nervously. One pulled out a mini bottle of hand sanitizer, squirted some into his palms, and offered the bottle across to Bryce. "Better safe than itchy." Bryce accepted it with flair, then turned to Silas and added, "No offense, man. You know, workplace safety and all." The elevator dinged. Bryce stepped out, grinning. One woman stayed behind and glanced at Silas with vague discomfort. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence was affirmation. He was beneath defense. That evening, Silas didn't go home right away. He remained in the janitor's closet long after his shift had ended, sitting on an overturned crate, staring at the wall. In his hands, he held the plastic-wrapped shirt from the night before. When the team started trickling in, laughter followed like a breeze through a cracked door. They filed in wearing stiff collars and designer sarcasm, their voices hushed just enough to pretend civility, but loud enough for Silas to feel the weight of every offhand word. He was used to it, used to being ignored until summoned, used to being needed but never acknowledged. But today, something in the air felt staged. The room filled quickly, supervisors arriving with coffee and impatience, and Silas turned to leave before the meeting began. He was nearly out the door when Callahan, the facilities director, called out, "Silas, we need you to clean the board before we start." Silas froze. The board was spotless. He had wiped it down less than 10 minutes ago. Still, without speaking, he nodded and returned. The room fell silent. every eye following his quiet steps. As he reached for the cloth and leaned forward to scrub nothing from a surface already gleaming, someone behind him stifled a laugh. Then another. A chair creaked. A cough was faked with dramatic force. Phones were raised not to record, but simply held aloft, as if mocking the idea of making his humiliation viral was entertainment in itself. "Get his good side," someone whispered, followed by a burst of snickering. Silas kept wiping. His fingers moved slowly, his back bent at an awkward angle, his breath measured and deep. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than their noise. He knew the game, knew this wasn't about cleanliness or service or protocol. This was about power, and he was the punchline. He finished wiping the board and set the cloth down with care, then turned and walked out without a word. They didn't thank him. They didn't even look at him as he left. Their attention had shifted to presentations and performance metrics, but the smirks lingered. A few still glanced toward the door like they were waiting to see if he'd snap. But he never did. That afternoon, after a long loop of cleaning stairwells and utility closets, Silas stopped by the men's restroom on the second floor to replace paper towels. The bathroom was empty, quiet, still foggy from a recent cleaning. But as he entered, something unfamiliar caught his eye, a pale blue shirt hanging from a hook on the far stall door. He knew the shirt instantly. It was his. Not the one he wore now, but the one that had gone missing from his locker 2 days earlier. It hung loosely, limp, collar turned inside out, sleeves dangling just above the toilet lid. Pinned beneath it was a note, handwritten in black marker on copier paper. It read, "For the unemployed, free to a good home." Below the text, someone had drawn a crude sketch of a stick figure pushing a mop into a coffin. Silas stood still. The paper towel dispenser clicked behind him as it refilled, the sound mechanical and indifferent. He didn't move for nearly a minute. He simply stared at the shirt, the fibers he'd worn through winters, the stitching he'd mended twice, the only clean one left when the others were damaged. Someone had broken into his locker, stolen it, and staged this like a joke, like a warning. He stepped forward, untacked the paper, unhooked the shirt, and folded it slowly, deliberately. He didn't throw it away. He didn't report it. He placed it in his bag like something sacred, like a fallen flag. Outside the bathroom, a junior staffer passed him with earbuds in and glanced at the folded shirt. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he said nothing. Silas arrived at the back entrance as requested, dressed in his cleanest uniform shirt, creased, tucked, and buttoned up to the collar. His name tag had been scrubbed with toothpaste and polished with a microfiber rag until the scratches dulled and the lettering stood proud once again. He had received an email from Human Resources the week prior, congratulating him on 15 years of service and inviting him to attend the ceremony to accept a plaque in recognition of dedication and humility. Those last 2 words rang hollow in his mind as he waited in the utility corridor beside the banquet hall, watching the crowd through a narrow gap in the door. Inside, applause filled the room as names were called. Department heads strutted to the stage, shaking hands with board members and posing for pictures beneath a large projection screen that flashed employee portraits and milestones. A woman from legal received a crystal globe for 10 years of service. A man from tech support got a standing ovation for recovering lost project files during a server outage. Each award was met with cheer, clinking glasses, and swelling orchestral music from the speakers. When the MC, a silver-haired VP with a booming voice, stepped back to the podium and announced, "Next, a special recognition for a man who has quietly supported this company longer than many of us have been here. Someone who never asks for praise and never misses a day." Silas felt a strange flutter rise in his chest. The slide behind the speaker changed to a photo of him from the staff database, years old, with flatter cheeks and a younger gaze. But the name beneath it wasn't his. It read, Simon Weathers. Silas blinked. A few people clapped, uncertain, while others turned to each other in confusion. Then, as if oblivious to the mistake, the MC continued, "Simon, please join us." A spotlight hit the back of the room, aimed directly where Silas stood. He hesitated. Someone behind him nudged his arm gently. Go, it's you. You deserve this. Silas stepped through the doors and made his way toward the stage. The applause swelled. He walked slowly, straight-backed, hands folded in front of him. As he climbed the steps, the MC smiled tightly and extended the folder containing the certificate. But just as Silas reached for it, the man's expression shifted. He squinted at the paper, then turned toward the side stage, murmuring something into a headset. A moment passed. Then, too, the room began to murmur. The MC's voice returned to the microphone, this time faltering slightly. I've just been informed there's been a clerical issue. It seems this award was meant for another employee. Apologies. Mr. Weaver, we'll follow up with you separately." He offered a weak, embarrassed chuckle, then tucked the folder under his arm and gestured toward the stairs. Silas didn't move at first. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. He looked at the audience, their mixed faces, some curious, some amused, others already turning away. Then, quietly, he descended the stairs. As he reached the floor, the silence broke. From the back of the room, a voice called out. Guess the plaque ran off with his mop water. Laughter exploded. Real laughter. Loud, guttural, uncontained. Some clapped. One man banged his glass on the table and shouted, "Give him a Swiffer next time." Another voice added, or just named the janitor closet after him. Silas kept walking. Each step felt heavier. He reached the exit doors at the side of the hall and pushed through without turning around. The laughter followed him, even as the doors closed behind. Outside, the night was cooler than expected. Wind pushed through the alley beside the building, tugging at his sleeves. The building moved on, but not without adjusting the weight it placed on his back. On Wednesday morning, he found a new assignment sheet taped to his locker door. The paper was thicker than the usual recycled printouts, the heading marked with bold, centered lettering. Adjusted Custodial Rotation Efficiency Initiative Pilot. Below the title, his name appeared alone. Not Simon, not Spinney, but Silas Weaver, properly spelled, properly printed, as if the formality itself made the insult more palatable. The list detailed twice the coverage zone he normally handled. 5 floors instead of 2, extended restroom sanitation, supply inventory, exterior garbage sweep, and furniture relocation for 3 conference rooms. At the bottom, in smaller font, a note read, "Due to ongoing communication challenges, additional physical contributions have been rebalanced accordingly." He stared at the paper, unmoving, for nearly a full minute. Communication challenges. That was the phrase they used now. Not incompetence, not failure. Just coded language for difference, for accent, for background, for being outside their design. When Silas brought the paper to the custodial supervisor, a broad-chested man named Lenley, the response was already rehearsed. Lenley sat behind his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee. The office too warm and too cramped for the two of them. He looked at the paper, pretended to read it, then leaned back in his squeaky leather chair and said, "The team discussed this, Silas. It's a consensus model. The feedback came from multiple departments. They feel your verbal interactions create friction, and it's easier to balance things out physically. You're still a valued part of the operation." Silas didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "So they think I should work twice as hard because they don't like how I sound?" Lenley didn't blink. "It's not personal, just procedural." Silas folded the paper in half, slowly, precisely, and slipped it into his front pocket. "And who decided this?" he asked. Lenley shrugged, waving a hand lazily toward the window that looked out onto the hallway. "Honestly, Silas, the whole office agreed it was better this way. Cleaner flow, less miscommunication." Outside the glass, a few employees walked past. One of them, a woman from HR, glanced into the office, made eye contact with Silas, and offered a faint smile. Her head tilted slightly in that apologetic way people do when they recognize cruelty, but have no intention of intervening. Silas didn't respond. He turned, exited the room, and returned to the supply closet without a word. That day, he completed every task on the list. He sanitized the break rooms. He replaced every light bulb on the 3rd floor. He dragged 8 conference tables into new configurations without assistance. By evening, His shirt clung to him like wet gauze, and his hands had blistered beneath the gloves. Still, he didn't stop. On the 5th floor, just after sunset, he entered the marketing suite to mop the hardwood floor. The office was mostly empty, except for a group of 4 remaining staffers gathered around a central desk. They saw him enter. They saw the mop. They saw his soaked collar and the exhaustion behind his eyes. But instead of moving their chairs aside or acknowledging his work, they remained seated and continued their conversation. One of them turned, raised his phone, and mimicked recording him. "Guess you've been promoted to the silent treatment department," he said, chuckling. Another added, "Maybe if he works fast enough, his accent will catch up to him." The others laughed. No one stopped them. Silas continued mopping. Each pass of the floor stripped away his presence, leaving only silence and sweat behind. At 9:32 p.m., long after the others had left, he returned to the janitor's closet and sat on the overturned crate beside the sink. The air was stale with bleach and age. He pulled the paper from his pocket and unfolded it. The lines were now smudged from friction, but the message remained legible. On Friday morning, the air buzzed with tension. There was a last-minute emergency. An unannounced visit from a triad of high-profile international partners from Germany, Japan, and the UAE, arriving to finalize a global distribution deal that could alter the entire structure of Holden and Royce. The company's head translator, Rachel Malden, had called out sick just hours earlier, leaving the executive suite scrambling. No one else on staff had the linguistic credentials to conduct such high-level, multilateral communication, and the first meeting was set to begin in 20 minutes. Panic bloomed behind every corner of the top floor. Conference Room 3 was converted into a makeshift negotiation hub, and assistants ran down the halls balancing documents and coffee trays with trembling fingers. In the break room, 2 VPs debated whether to push the meeting back or try using translation software, while a junior analyst whispered that this could cost them everything. Then, somewhere between the rustling of prep work and the clamor of rushed planning, a quiet voice offered help. Silas, mopping the glass wall outside the meeting room, had paused. He had listened to their strained attempts at German, one VP mispronouncing Herzlich Willkommen into something closer to Hurl Sick Welcome. He had watched the group from Japan shift uncomfortably, struggling to follow the muddled English around them. And finally, he stepped forward. At first, no one noticed him. Then, slowly, eyes turned toward the man with the name badge and the mop. One executive scoffed. Another cleared her throat and said, "Sorry, we're in the middle of something important." Silas simply asked, "May I try?" It wasn't arrogance. It was necessity. Then he switched to German. The syntax was crisp. The accent near perfect. "Entschuldigen Sie bitte die Verwirrung. Wir freuen uns sehr, Sie hier begrüßen zu dürfen." The visiting German representative blinked, then smiled slowly. He replied with a full sentence. Silas answered back without hesitation. The conversation turned seamless. Heads turned. The room fell still. Someone from the Japanese delegation stood up. "Nihongo, hanasemasu ka?" Silas nodded, bowing slightly, and answered, "Mochiro, gohouben wo okakeshite moshiwake arimasen." His tone was formal, respectful, flowing with native cadence. The Japanese team's leader smiled, gestured for him to sit. The VP, who had earlier dismissed him, now whispered something into her headset. A member of the UAE contingent leaned forward and addressed him in Arabic. Silas responded fluently, adjusting his dialect to match Gulf pronunciation, explaining how the logistical plans would respect customs regulations across borders. The visitors leaned back, relaxed. Trust, once fractured, had returned. For nearly 30 minutes, Silas conducted 3 conversations at once, flowing between languages with calm, deliberate precision, mediating misunderstandings and clarifying figures that no one else had dared to paraphrase. The CEO, Marcus Hale, stepped into the room midway through the exchange. He had been briefed about the translation crisis and arrived expecting chaos. Instead, he found a quiet, balanced discussion led by a janitor in navy blue. He stood in the doorway, unnoticed, arms folded, observing. He listened as Silas answered a layered trade compliance question in flawless Russian. Это положение уже соблюдается в нашем текущем контракте. Мы готовы внести корректировки, если потребуется. The CEO raised an eyebrow. After a long pause, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said to the room. "Mr. Weaver, was it?" Silas nodded, turning calmly. "Yes, sir." Hale asked a question in Russian, deliberately obscure, involving tariff classifications and transport liability. Silas responded instantly, then elaborated on the implications using specific terminology drawn from maritime law. The room was silent. Someone exhaled audibly. The CEO looked at the delegation, then at Silas, then at his executive team. "Can someone tell me," he said slowly, "why this man was mopping windows outside instead of sitting in here to begin with?" No one answered. The silence deepened, not with awkwardness, but with exposure. Behind their tailored suits and curated smiles, no one could claim ignorance anymore. And now, every floor was waiting to see what would happen next. By early afternoon, Silas received a direct invitation from the executive suite, not through the custodial supervisor, not tacked onto his locker door, but hand-delivered by the CEO's personal assistant. The envelope bore his name in clean calligraphy. Inside, a single sheet of heavy stock paper. "Mr. Weaver, please join us at 2 p.m. in Executive Strategy Room 12B. Marcus Hale." He showed up on time, uniform pressed, collar stiff, hands folded behind his back. When he entered the room, the table was already full: COOs, regional directors, heads of logistics, marketing, compliance. These were the decision makers, the ones who had built walls around themselves, so high that men like Silas had always been expected to clean the base without ever seeing the top. And yet, here he was, being offered a seat at their table. Marcus Hale stood up and gestured for Silas to take the empty chair beside him. "We're restructuring our global engagement strategy," the CEO began, his voice calm, focused. "And frankly, we've realized we need a perspective we've overlooked for far too long." He paused and looked directly at Silas. "I want you here not as a guest, but as a fixture. From today forward, you'll serve as strategic advisor on cross-cultural communications. You'll report directly to me." The room didn't gasp. These people didn't gasp. But their silence was deafening. No one smiled. No one congratulated him. But no one dared to oppose it either. Hale continued, "We've created a new role for you. Title: Cultural Liaison Officer. Pay grade: Executive Band 4. Status: Senior Staff." Silas nodded once, slowly. He didn't need to speak. His silence had never been more powerful. That evening, a company-wide meeting was called. Unscheduled. Mandatory. A folding stage was assembled in the atrium, the very same space where Silas had once scrubbed footprints beneath decorative palms. As employees gathered, the air buzzed with speculation. Some thought it was a restructure. Others whispered about layoffs or damage control. No one guessed what was coming. When Marcus Hale took the microphone, he didn't open with pleasantries. He opened with a question. "How many of you know Silas Weaver?" Most hands went up, cautiously. "And how many of you," he continued, "know where he studied, what he speaks, where he's worked before Halden and Royce?" No hands raised. Not one. Hale turned toward Silas, who now stood beside him on the stage, wearing the same uniform he'd worn that morning, but with a presence that made him seem 10 feet tall. "Let me tell you," the CEO said, "Silas studied linguistics and international relations at Georgetown. He speaks 9 languages fluently and holds 2 certifications in diplomatic protocol from Geneva and Kyoto. Before joining us, he worked in crisis mediation for the World Health Organization and served as a field liaison during the refugee coordination effort in Northern Africa." The room was silent. Heads turned. Faces paled. Hale's voice deepened. "And for the past 15 years, he's been scrubbing our floors while we ignored his resume, his brilliance, and his humanity." A murmur rolled through the crowd like a low tide of guilt. Hale gestured toward the crowd. "Some of you laughed at his accent. Some of you called him names. Some of you voted to double his workload because you thought he didn't speak clearly enough." He paused. "But this morning, when we needed someone to save a global negotiation, he didn't hesitate. He stepped in. and he did it better than anyone else in this building could have. Eyes dropped, shoulders stiffened. The people who had once mocked Silas now stood frozen, trapped in the mirror of their own bias. By Monday morning, things changed dramatically, deliberately, and without subtlety. HR meetings were suddenly scheduled back-to-back, most of them targeting names everyone recognized, especially those who had lingered in the orbit of the cruelty that Silas had endured for over a decade. The internal ethics team moved swiftly, equipped with statements, testimonies, and a dossier of compiled behaviors going back years, most of which had been documented quietly by witnesses who never spoke before, but now saw which way the moral wind was blowing. The memo was issued that afternoon. 7 employees had been placed under formal investigation for discriminatory conduct, harassment, and systemic sabotage of internal equity protocols. Their names were listed plainly. Their departments too. They were placed on immediate, unpaid suspension pending a third-party review, and required to surrender their company access badges within the hour. When the list hit inboxes, an eerie calm spread through the building. Like a storm had passed, but the debris remained. People scrolled slowly, rereading the names. Colin from logistics, Mara from PR, Bryce from finance. Others, who had once stood on the front lines of mockery, now pushed to the sidelines of accountability. At 3 p.m., those 7 were escorted, calmly, firmly, to the HR floor. Inside conference room A, a long table awaited them, and beside it sat the head of legal compliance, Denise Harmon, a woman known for her precision and unshakable ethics. Each person was handed a formal notice of allegation, with their infractions summarized clearly: use of demeaning language, manipulation of duties, public shaming, targeted actions rooted in linguistic or cultural bias. Most stared at the papers in stunned silence. One scoffed. One muttered that this had gone too far. But when they reached Bryce, loudest of them all, he refused to sign the acknowledgement form. "You think I'm going to agree to this? This is political theater," he snapped, pushing the document across the table. Denise remained composed. She looked around the room, then said, "Very well. Then I'll read it for you." Out loud. She opened the file. The room tensed. On April 9th, at 9:17 a.m., you entered Elevator B with Mr. Silas Weaver. Upon entry, you raised your hands and said, "Should I be worried? I read somewhere that mold can spread from janitor uniforms." 2 of your peers laughed. One offered you hand sanitizer. You accepted and replied, "Better safe than itchy," while looking at Mr. Weaver. You followed that by stating, "No offense, man. You know, workplace safety and all." She paused, flipped to the next page. On March 28th, in conference room 3C, during a departmental debrief, you held your phone aloft while Mr. Weaver was wiping a clean board. You did not record video. You did, however, mimic recording and then whispered, "Get his good side," while others laughed. Bryce looked away, jaw tight. Denise continued. On February 17th, you participated in a group email thread in which a photoshopped image of Mr. Weaver's face on a cartoon toilet cleaner was circulated. The subject line read, "Spinny saves the day." One of the women in the room closed her eyes. Another covered her mouth. "You may not wish to sign," Denise said, "but you don't get to pretend this didn't happen. We have the records. We have the witnesses. You had power. You used it to diminish a man's humanity. And now we're using ours to hold you accountable." There were no arguments, no further deflections, only silence, sharpened by the sound of pages turning as other reports were reviewed one by one. Elsewhere in the building, conversations took a different tone. At the water cooler, someone said, "I used to laugh at the jokes too." Time, though indifferent to guilt or redemption, has a way of softening what once seemed irreparable. 3 months passed since the day justice unfolded in the atrium of Halden and Royce, and in that time, the building changed, not in architecture or policy, but in atmosphere. The silence that used to blanket the halls with fear and prejudice had become a space for uncomfortable reflection. The whispers of cruelty that once echoed through copy rooms and conference calls faded into reluctant acknowledgments, quiet corrections, and intentional decency. Silas, now dressed in pressed slacks and an open-collar shirt rather than a janitor's uniform, walked those same halls with the kind of quiet presence that no longer needed to prove anything. His office was modest, tucked beside the executive wing, not ostentatious, but respected. His calendar was filled not with cleaning rotations, but with global strategy calls, language advisory sessions, and diversity council meetings. But it wasn't titles or salary that marked the true change. It was the way people looked at him now, not over, not through, but toward. On a rainy Thursday in May, Silas sat on the stage of a regional business ethics summit, a microphone clipped discreetly to his lapel. The auditorium wasn't full of executives in designer suits. It held students, nonprofit leaders, small business owners, and HR professionals, all gathered to hear about restorative practices in modern workplaces. The topic of the panel was simple but urgent: equity beyond apology. Silas didn't lecture. He didn't rehearse. When it was his turn to speak, he opened a small envelope and pulled out a single folded letter. His hands were steady, his voice calm. "This was written to me," he began, "not by a stranger, but by someone who once called me names I don't care to repeat. Someone who believed my silence was submission and my accent was inferiority. Someone who has now lost a job, but perhaps found a truth greater than any position." The audience leaned in. Silas continued. The letter reads, "Mr. Weaver, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve your attention. But I need to say what I never had the courage to say when I saw you every day. I mocked you because I feared you. Your steadiness, your dignity, your refusal to become like us. It shamed me. And I didn't know how to deal with that except to laugh at it. We weren't laughing at you. We were laughing to avoid ourselves. I see that now. I have started therapy. I have taken courses in bias and equity. I volunteer now, not because I want to be seen doing good, but because I finally understand how little I knew about decency. I used to think I was superior because I had a desk. But now, I clean my own dishes, and I think of you every time I reach for a mop. Thank you for not becoming bitter. Thank you for reminding me what a man looks like." Silas folded the letter again. He did not name the sender. He didn't need to. "Some people," he said to the crowd, "believe justice is loud, suspensions, terminations, headlines. But I've learned that justice can also be quiet. It's in the way someone looks at a stranger and chooses kindness over assumption. It's in the humility to admit you were wrong without expecting applause. And sometimes," he paused, "justice is simply letting someone change." After the panel, several attendees waited to speak to him. One young woman asked if she could use the letter in her thesis on restorative workplace practices. Another thanked him for giving her father, a janitor himself, the dignity she always felt he deserved. But Silas didn't stay long. He never liked stages. He liked silence. He liked walking unnoticed, not because he was invisible, but because he had nothing left to prove. Back at the office, a few things had changed permanently. His old cart remained in the janitor's closet, untouched, preserved like a relic. On the shelf beside it sat a framed photograph, not of Silas, but of the mop handle he once carried, with a simple inscription: "Strength wears many uniforms." His former supervisor now served as a support consultant for bias intervention. Several employees who had remained silent during his years of mistreatment had since attended weekly reflection sessions and started a scholarship fund in Silas's name for bilingual students pursuing cultural diplomacy. And among those who had once laughed, 3 returned, not for employment, but for conversation. One of them, the same man who sprayed cologne in the elevator and called him a walking fungus, now worked at a nonprofit, teaching young boys how to unlearn cruelty. When he met with Silas, he didn't beg. He listened. He asked questions. And Silas gave him the one thing most couldn't offer in return: time. That night, as the sun set over the quiet city skyline, Silas sat at his desk with the window open, letting the spring air drift through. He looked out not with triumph, but with stillness. In the reflection of the glass, he no longer saw the man pushing the cart. He saw a man who had endured, who had lifted more than trash bins, who had translated pain into grace. And behind that reflection, He saw the shape of a company no longer afraid to reckon with itself. Because sometimes justice isn't in the fall of the mighty, but in the rise of the unseen. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives about justice, redemption, and the strength of character. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment in the story struck you the most? Was there a part that made you stop and think? Let us know in the comments below. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We're always curious to see how far these stories reach.